Hey, it's me, Saul. So, I've been trying to make this video for the last couple of hours and I've been struggling a little bit. The reason being, I don't think I know how to. I want this video to be perfect and give just the best way of building this archetype that I love, but at the same time, I don't want to come across as overbearing. I'm the type of person who loves it when people build decks in their own way and add their own unique variety and flavor and mix things up, because to me, that's the most fun part of Yu-Gi-Oh! So imagine how difficult it is to then make a deck building guide where I'm trying to instruct you on how to go about making a deck. It's a conundrum. But what I think I've decided on is to just give you a rough outline on what to consider when making a Bujin deck. This isn't the hard and fast rules. These are just the things that I've come to appreciate over roughly 3 years of playing the Bujins and adapting with the times using them. So you can take this video with a grain of salt if you like. If you're just looking for a way to find out more about the archetype or things that you should consider when building your own deck, that's what this video is for. So we are considering how to build a Bujin deck. Let's get started. All right, so welcome to the lab. I'm going to cover a couple of things with you here. The first thing I'm going to talk about is what this archetype does. The next thing I'm going to tell you is what this archetype needs in order to function. And the last thing I'm going to go over with you is what I believe the competitively viable cards are. I'll also show you some of my own Bujin decks that I've made over the years, just for context towards the end. But there's going to be a completely separate guide video where I talk about the different combos, strategies, and win conditions that go into making this deck. So, if you haven't watched my previous video where I talk about who the Bujins are and what the variety of different cards in the archetype do, you might want to check that out before you go into this one. I'm going to be throwing a lot of names around with the assumption that you have at least a rough idea what they do, right? Now, the Bujin archetype is an archetype that consists of level 4 light monsters. All of the monsters in the archetype are either beasts, beast warriors, or winged beast type monsters. You have 2 extra deck monsters, which include the Susanoo and the Tsukiyomi. Now, the strategy of this card is effectively to do everything, but it's not that simple. This card can basically do anything in the game. However, it needs the proper setup in order to do it. You have 4 main beast warrior monsters in the deck. That is Yamato, Arasuda, Hirume, and Mikazuchi. These 4 beast warriors are the heart of the deck, and everything that happens in the deck revolves around them. The Bujin Yamato has the ability, while it's on the field, to choose a beast monster that's in your deck and send it to the graveyard during your end phase. Now, why that's important is because all of the beast monsters in the deck are called Bujingi monsters. What they do is, well, they're where the anything part comes in. Every single Bujingi monster in the deck has a different effect. For instance, while the crane is in your hand, it allows you to double your original attack. While the hare is in your graveyard, it allows you to escape destruction once. When the turtle's in your graveyard, it allows you to escape targeting once. The Quillin in your graveyard allows you to destroy any face-up monster once. And so on and so forth, right? So, the point of the deck is to get the Bujingi cards into your graveyard or onto your field, and then allow your beast warrior monsters to use them to their advantage, because the majority of the effects of the beast monsters only activate when there is a beast warrior on the field. Now, that's not all that the deck does. For a long time, it was all that the deck did. However, now we have an XYZ monster that acts as our boss monster. It's an end goal for the deck, the Bujente Susanoo. So another thing that you want this deck to do is to get 2 monsters on the field effectively. They don't have to both be beast warriors or beast monsters. It can be any 2 monsters that are Bujin monsters on your field. Combine them to bring out your Bujin Susanoo. Now, what this card does is, it has Yamato's effect, but it's faster. You can choose any card in your deck and either add it to your hand or send it to the graveyard once per turn, but it's not during your end phase, meaning during your main phase, if you think that there's an effect that you need that will help you win the duel, you can get any effect in the game immediately. Let's say you think that you need to pop something that's face up, you get a Quillin in your graveyard. Let's say you need to pop back row, you get a Centipede in your graveyard. Let's say you need to beat over your opponent's monster, you get a Sinew in the graveyard, and so on and so forth. If you need to attack directly, get Ophidian from your deck. if you need to attack twice, well, the Susanoo has the ability to attack every monster your opponent controls once each, so you probably don't need that effect. But let's say you're pairing it with Ophidian and you want to attack twice directly, then there you go. There are so many different things that you can do once you get the Susanoo on the field, and rather than having to wait to the end phase, you can do it as soon as you get the card on the field. So that is what this deck does. Get the Bujingi monsters in the graveyard or in your hand in order to use their effects to support the Bujin monsters on the field to facilitate the bringing out of Bujente Susanoo, which will most likely be able to win you the duel. Alright? Now, the next thing to consider is what this deck needs to function. This deck has a couple of weaknesses. This archetype has a couple of weaknesses, and I'm going to go over them with you. Within the Bujin archetype, there don't exist any spell or trap card support that facilitate you getting your Bujin monsters or your Bujingi monsters from the deck into the graveyard. What it revolves around is using your Beast Warrior monsters to use their effects to get cards from your deck to your hand, then to the graveyard. What that means is you have to use a normal summon for this archetype to do what it does. If your normal summon for a turn gets negated, let's say you want to get a Yamato on the field, then you're basically stuck. Or worse, let's say you don't get a Yamato in your hand. On the first turn of the duel, if you're using just the cards in this archetype, you're stuck because you can't get things into the graveyard with any other effects that exist within this archetype. So you have to keep that in mind when you're building a Bujin deck. The main thing that this deck wants to do, it can't really do on its own as efficiently as you might need to. It's quite slow. Most decks don't need to waste a normal summon to pop off exquisitely. A lot of them have cards that allow them to special summon themselves or combo with each other or pull things directly from the deck. But the Bujin deck has to wait to the end phase to even be able to pull its first card from the deck to the graveyard, and so on and so forth. So when you're building a deck like this, what you have to think in your mind is, how am I going to get my cards into the graveyard without being negated on the way there? The second thing to consider when building this deck is, you have no way to increase your speed with the archetype itself. Now, in my opinion, speed equals your ability to swarm the field plus your ability to set up whatever your core strategy is. This deck doesn't have that. The only Bujin monster that has the ability to special summon itself is the Bujin Hirume, and it requires a card to already be in the graveyard to activate that effect. Moreover, Hirume can only send Bujingi cards to the graveyard itself after it's been destroyed, meaning that it can't benefit from whatever effects it adds to the graveyard. That means that this deck has no way of special summoning its own monsters at the beginning of a duel in order to facilitate its plays. It's quite slow. You can't set up your core strategy, and you can't swarm the field using just the cards in this archetype. The only exception to this is if you've already lost a monster such as a Bujingi Fox and banished another monster or the fox itself, and then use Bujin Carnation. Bujin Carnation will allow you to special summon a monster from your graveyard and a banished monster, put both of them on the field, and you can go into an XYZ summon. But in order to do that, your opponent has to already control monsters, and you already have to have a card in the graveyard and a banished card, meaning that it requires some setup, and you're most likely not going to be able to do this until turn 3. As a result, there isn't really a fast way within the archetype to do what it needs to do. The third thing to consider is the back row of your opponent. What is your opponent going to do to respond to you? As I said before, if your normal summon gets negated, you're in a fair amount of trouble. So you have to consider back row removal that doesn't rely on the archetype itself. Like I said, cards like Centipede can destroy back row cards, but there has to be a Bujin card on the field to facilitate this effect. If Yamato isn't on the field, even if the Centipede is in the graveyard or another Beast Warrior isn't on the field, then you can't pop the back row. And let's say it's a Floodgate Trap Hole that you need to get rid of. Well, once you've summoned Yamato, the Floodgate Trap Hole gets activated anyway, and the Centipede wasn't able to fulfill its role. That means you also have to consider the back row removal aspect of this deck and how you're going to work around your opponent's back row. The final thing to consider is Graveyard Negation. This deck relies very heavily on the graveyard because a lot of the cards in the graveyard banish themselves to activate its wide variety of effects. If you go up against something like a Necrovalley or something that just negates your access to the graveyard, you are in a lot of trouble. So it's something to think about when building the deck. How do you get around it? I'm going to have a whole video where I talk about how you deal with Necrovalley as the Bujin archetype. So fear not if you can't think of anything. I'm coming. But yeah, so those are the things that you need to consider when choosing the cards to put into your Bujin deck. Now, to end this section, what I will say is that there are different weaknesses to this deck, and not all of them will always apply. For instance, in the Bujin deck that I currently run, well, let me just show it to you. In the Bujin deck that I currently run, I run absolutely no ways of getting my cards into the graveyard other than the ones that the archetype itself provides, because as part of my core strategy, it's not actually necessary. What this means is, you might be able to bypass some of the weaknesses that I've mentioned. Like I said, this video is to help give you an idea of the things you need to consider. It's not an outright list of rules that you need to follow. So just keep these things in mind as you go along. This is a very good segue into the next section though, which is where I'm going to talk to you about the different types of Bujin decks that there are. Now, there are two primary types of Bujin decks that exist. If you go on to Duel Links Meta or the Duel Links wiki page where they list some deck archetypes and how to build them, you'll see a variety of different ways that people build the Bujins. Now, one of the most popular ways to build them previously was to fill your deck with roughly 30 cards and just try and get as many of them to the graveyard as possible through the course of the duel, because the more cards you have in the deck, the more effects you have access to, and so therefore the more things your Bujin deck can do. So that is what I would call the big version of the deck, the one that is full of different cards, effects, varieties of things, and ways to go about making your plays. I actually used to have a deck that fit into that criteria, and I might as well just show it to you now. Now, this is my very first Bujin deck that I ever created. Please forgive me for using Mindscan back then. This is from a couple of years ago. As you can see, not all of the cards listed in the Bujin archetype are featured here, but this is a 30 card version of the deck where I used That Grass Looks Greener in order to send all of the cards from my deck that I needed in the deck to be in the graveyard to the graveyard. That was a very complicated way of saying a very simple thing. Basically, you can't do this anymore. That Grass Looks Greener has been banned. It wasn't banned because of the Bujins, it was banned because it's just a strong card in general, and much stronger decks than the Bujins were using it to their advantage, but we've all been affected now because of it. What this means is that you need to find other means of getting your cards into the graveyard if you're running with this strategy. One that I considered was using Needlebug Nest, but that's also now been limited to one. So maybe you can come up with something that I couldn't come up with, but for this reason and the difficulty in finding cards to help me facilitate that huge graveyard mill, I stopped running the large version of the Bujins and I moved to a more streamlined version of the Bujins. Now, I will say that there's no right way to build a deck, and you could probably find a way to make a big version of the Bujins work, a full deck work. I just don't know how to do it. So, in the more streamlined version of the Bujins, what you see is that there's far less cards and effects that are available to you. What you do is you take the essentials and you revolve them around Yamato, so you're extremely selective about the cards that are in the deck. You don't have anything more in the graveyard than you need, and you don't have anything more in the hand that you need. On top of that, you rely more on spells and traps than you would have needed to with the other version, because you don't have as many Bujins available in order to facilitate all of the crazy plays that you might be able to make within the archetype. Now, as you can see, this strategy is very specific to me. I call it the XYZ Bujin double jump, and I'll teach you about it in the upcoming video. But with that being said, you don't have to use the Quillin. You might think you need to run the Crane at 3. You might only use 1 Sinew, or you might use 3 Sinew. You might be thinking that it's insane for me to not be using Turtle in my deck, or the Hare. There are so many different cards in this archetype that you can use that make it so that your deck can be built with an insane degree of variety. You can, in fact, you can most likely mix a full version of the deck with the streamlined version of the deck and find a way to make it work. You might think of a win condition that involves, for instance, maybe you want to use a Bujingi Boar and tie that with Bujingi Ibis, this boy, right? Maybe your core strategy revolves around setting your opponent's cards to defense position and then crashing into them with piercing damage. This would allow you to do that. You could tie that in with XYZ summoning. You could do something completely different. Let's say you wanted to have a revival deck where no matter what happens, if your monster gets destroyed, you can always bring one back. Well, then that means the Raven would be a good card to have in your deck, because you can, oh wait, no, this is the wrong card. I meant Pavo. See, I'm not even familiar with all of these cards, right? Pavo would allow you to special summon another Bujin monster from the grave, from your deck every time one is sent to the graveyard, and you would just always be able to bring one back and always have a body on the field. Or you could go the effect damage route with the Bujins. Yes, there's an effect damage version of the Bujins. I've never seen it, but I can envision one where you keep on negating attacks, keep on recycling the crow to your hand, and just making your opponent take a quarter of their damage over and over and over. You can mix this with other burn cards. You can mix this with other strategies. You could put Light Sworns into Bujins. You could put all sorts of things to help you to mill a deck. I just thought of a way to make a big Bujin deck work where you mill the cards. You use Light Sworns, see? This deck is extremely, extremely versatile. This archetype is versatile, and so you can do almost anything with it. There's only one core thing that I think you need to take into consideration no matter what type of build that you go with. The Bujins are, by definition, a slow archetype. In order to make them work, you either need to find a way to speed your deck up or slow your opponent down. What I mean by that is, we currently exist in an OTK meta. There are tons of decks where their whole plan, their whole strategy is wipe your board and then destroy you in one turn so you can't come back. But what if they can't do that? What if you find a way to make it to the next turn, or to slow the duel down to the point where you get the cards that you need, or you're able to fulfill your strategy? You slow the entire duel down so that they have to duel at your speed. That's not to say that you intentionally play slow. That's to say that you use the cards in your deck to make it so that your strategy can be fulfilled and you can't let them rush to their victory. For instance, let's say you use the hare to just continuously survive no matter what they throw at you, or you use 3 tortoises to make it so that whatever their plan is, they can't target you because you just negate the targeting every single time. What if you use the fox to say, nope, I'm not taking any damage this turn, and you just keep on going through the turns until you figure out what you want to do? Now, that might not be a fun way to play the Bujins, and personally, it's not my favorite way to play the Bujins. You can be a lot more aggressive and speed the deck up with support cards from outside of the archetype, or you could have a marriage of the two. In fact, my current Bujin deck is a marriage of the two. In my current Bujin deck, I have a strategy whereby I can either swarm the field with monsters, what I was talking about, your swarming ability plus your setup ability equals your speed. So I have a deck that helps me to swarm the field and then get all of the effects that I need quickly, because like I said, my version of the Bujins is very streamlined. I have a clear strategy, I have exactly the number of cards that I need to fulfill it. But in case that goes wrong, I also keep 2 copies of the fox. The fox facilitates my fast strategy, but in case something goes wrong, it allows me to take a step back and slow down the duel. Now, because I'm only running 2 and I don't run any hares or any tortoises, I can't slow it down as much as some other Bujin decks might be able to, but you see what I mean. The Bujins are effectively one of the best control decks that I feel exist in the game. You can do anything. You can decide the speed of the duel. You can decide how fast things go, how slow things go, what effects are allowed to go off, whether or not you're going to take damage in any form. That also includes effect damage in any form on any given turn. So whereas your opponent might want the duel to only take 2 turns, you can say, actually, I'm not taking damage this turn, so the duel is going to take 4 at least, right? That gives you time to set the things that you need to set up, and sometimes you might not need that, but if you ever do, it's available. It's just something that you need to keep in mind. Either you speed up or you slow them down. Now, the last thing that I wanted to talk to you about is what I feel are the most competitively viable cards and the ones that I think you need to get the most. The first one is the Bujin Crane. The Bujin Crane is, in my opinion, one of the strongest cards in this archetype. The Crane allows you to double your attack during damage calculation, and I talked a little bit about it in the video that I did where I just said who these cards are, so if you want more information on it, you can just look for it there. But as a summary, you can double your attack during damage calculation, and it ignores any debuffs that you've currently got on your attack. It's your original attack that gets applied, right? Now, the crazy thing about this is, after you've boosted your attack ×2, let's say you have had a debuff applied to your monster, that debuff goes away after the Crane's effect has been applied, meaning that you just not only have you beaten over your opponent's monster and destroyed it most likely, but whatever they used to reduce your attack, you've also negated. You've basically wasted their effect. So that's a very, very, very strong card, and it's not a hard once per turn. If you have 3 cards in your hand and you're about to battle 3 monsters, you can use it on each and every one of them. Now, the second meta card, in my opinion, is the turtle. We live in a meta where people are always trying to target you. They're always trying to get your monsters off of the field. This can protect you from that, and it works hand in hand with the hare, where even, let's say you're about to be destroyed and it's not targeted. Let's say you're facing, I don't think the Desperado Barrel Dragon targets. The hare can protect you from the destruction effect and allow you to continue damage calculation. I'm most likely going to be adding this card to my deck just because of how prevalent Desperado Dragon is becoming and how easy it would be to get past its effect if I could just negate the one destruction. Now, another card in the deck that I feel like is extremely meta is Ophidian. The ability to attack your opponent directly is huge because we live in a meta game where currently you only have 4,000 life points. So imagine using this on Bujente Susano, no other effects applied, you've just done 2,400 damage to your opponent. Now, that is a huge effect, and it's one that I don't think should be slept on. The Sinew gives you the ability to boost your attack to any value in the game. No matter how high your opponent's attack is, the Sinew will allow you to add their attack to yours, which means that you've now boosted over them. Now, the last super meta card I would say is the Fox. The Fox gives you the ability to, like I said, banish it from your graveyard, send another Bujin from your hand to the graveyard, which runs really well with the other effects in the deck, and you take absolutely no battle damage on that turn. In my opinion, it's one of the most important cards in the deck to get. Unfortunately, it was released it was released in the Aerial Assault pack, so it's not really with the other Bujin cards. You will have to go out of your way to get it, but the card is only, let me find it. Right, the card is only a normal, and I've gotten some out of the pack, which is why I think it's currently at 6. I'm pretty sure it's more than that. So your chances of getting this card when you're going for, say, a Black Wings deck or just a Brionic or anything, very, very high. You might already have this card without even realizing it, because despite being so scattered about, because so many of these cards are just normal and easy to get, you're not going to struggle to build the Bujin deck in any regard. Now, even though I haven't specifically commented on many of the other cards, that's not to say I don't think they're good in any way, shape, or form. I'm just talking about what I believe are the most competitive cards. So if you wanted to just narrow down the pack, you could absolutely find a use for Pavo. You could absolutely find a use for the Wolf or for the Crow in a version of the Bujins that I've never thought of. That's what I want you to take away from this video, if anything, is that you can build the Bujins however you want to build them. So long as you keep the things that I've talked about in this video in mind, you will be able to come up with something competitively viable, in my opinion. That's how I came up with my Bujin deck. I just sat down, I thought about these things, I thought about how I wanted to get around the weaknesses of the deck, and I built a deck that I'm extremely proud of. Now, when it comes to the Beast Warrior cards, it really is up to you how you decide to filter them into your deck. I don't use Hirome in my deck, but I used to, because the ability to special summon a Bujin is very, very useful when going into XYZ summons. So the fact that I don't use this doesn't mean that you shouldn't. Arasuda and Mikazuchi, very, very good. It really just depends on what you want the deck to do, and the same applies to the spells and traps. To be honest with you, the only spell and trap that I use is Bujin Carnation, but I recently realized Bujin Intervention is an extremely good card. You can banish every card of the same name from your opponent's field, hand, deck, graveyard, extra deck, everything. You can banish all of it if you use this card correctly. So because I haven't found a use for this card yet, or because I haven't found a way to make it work yet, that doesn't mean that you can't. Beat me to the punch, please. I want you to. And then maybe you can teach me how you went about it, and I can see if I can fit that strategy into my deck, because I want you to build the Bujin deck, right? So, with that being said, I think that's everything that you need to consider when trying to build a Bujin deck. If you have questions or comments, please leave them down below. I'd be happy to answer them, or just hit me up on Discord. The link is in the description, and we can talk about it. Like I said, I wasn't exactly sure how to go about making this video, so I do hope you were able to follow with me to the end. I really do hope it was useful for you, and I can't wait to see what you make, because yeah, I love deck building, if you couldn't tell. I don't know how to end this video, just how I didn't know how to make it, so bye.